William sat in his small office, staring at the computer screen that had become his window into a world he never knew existed. The rain outside matched his mood as he scrolled through endless files, each one revealing more disturbing details about the woman he had loved and married 15 years ago. Catherine had always been mysterious. When they first met at the university library, she seemed like the perfect woman, intelligent, beautiful, with an air of sophistication that drew him in immediately. She never talked much about her past, claiming it was too painful to discuss. William respected her privacy, thinking she had experienced some childhood trauma that she wasn't ready to share. Now, as he looked at the evidence spread across his desk, he realized how wrong he had been. The woman he thought he knew was nothing more than an elaborate fiction. It started 3 weeks ago when Catherine received a phone call late at night. She had stepped outside to take it, which was unusual for her. William heard her speaking in a language he couldn't identify, her voice urgent and worried. When she came back inside, she claimed it was a wrong number, but her hands were shaking as she poured herself a glass of wine. The next morning, William found a business card that had fallen from Catherine's purse. It had no company name, just a phone number and an address in the city. Something about it bothered him, so he decided to investigate. What he discovered changed everything. The address led him to a small office building in a part of town he rarely visited. The directory in the lobby showed no businesses matching the address on the card. Confused, William asked the security guard about it. The man looked nervous and said he couldn't help, but William noticed him making a phone call as soon as he thought William had left. William waited across the street for 2 hours before he saw Catherine emerge from the building. She looked completely different. Her hair was pulled back severely, she wore dark sunglasses, and her usual warm smile was replaced by a cold, calculated expression. She got into a car with 2 men William had never seen before. That night, Catherine came home at her usual time, acting as if nothing had happened. She kissed William hello, asked about his day, and started preparing dinner just like always. But William couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The woman in his kitchen seemed like a stranger wearing Catherine's face. Over the next few days, William began paying closer attention to his wife's behavior. He noticed small things that had never registered before, how she never received mail at their house, how she paid for everything in cash, how she never seemed to have any old friends or family members who called or visited. William started following Catherine during her supposed work hours. She claimed to be a freelance translator, working from various locations around the city. But instead of going to libraries or coffee shops like she said, Catherine visited a series of unmarked buildings, always staying for exactly 1 hour before moving to the next location. One afternoon, William gathered the courage to enter one of these buildings after Catherine left. He told the receptionist he was there to see his wife, describing Catherine in detail. The woman's face went pale, and she quickly said there was no one there by that description. But William could see the fear in her eyes. That evening, William confronted Catherine directly. He told her about following her and asked her to explain what was really going on. Catherine's reaction was unlike anything he had ever seen from her. For a moment, her mask slipped completely, and he saw something cold and dangerous in her eyes. Then, she smiled and laughed, saying he must have been mistaken about seeing her. But William knew what he had seen. He decided to hire a private investigator. The investigator, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, agreed to look into Catherine's background. Within a week, she called William with disturbing news. There was no record of Catherine existing before she appeared at the university 15 years ago. No birth certificate, no school records, no employment history, nothing. Sarah suggested they dig deeper, warning William that he might not like what they found. William insisted they continue, despite his growing fear about what the truth might reveal. The investigation led them to immigration records that had been sealed for reasons of national security. Sarah had contacts who could access these files, but it would take time and considerable money. William didn't care about the cost. He needed to know who his wife really was. While waiting for those results, William decided to search through Catherine's personal belongings more carefully. He had always respected her privacy, never going through her things without permission. Now he wondered what he might have missed. In a locked box in the back of Catherine's closet, William found documents that made his blood run cold. There were multiple passports, all with Catherine's photo, but different names. Driver's licenses from various states, all issued within the last 15 years. And, most disturbing of all, newspaper clippings about missing persons cases, with certain details highlighted in red ink. William's hands shook as he examined each document. The photos on the passports showed Catherine, but Her appearance was subtly different in each one. Different hair color, different style of dress, even different facial expressions that made her look like completely different people. One of the newspaper clippings was about a wealthy businessman who had disappeared 3 years before William met Catherine. The man had last been seen having dinner with an unidentified woman matching Catherine's description. Another article described a missing art dealer who had vanished after meeting with a potential client. Again, a woman who looked remarkably like Catherine. William felt sick as he counted the clippings. There were 12 different cases spanning 8 years, all involving missing men who had been last seen with women who could have been Catherine. The highlighted details in each article focused on the substantial wealth or valuable assets each man possessed. The private investigator called that night with the immigration records. Catherine's real name was Elena Volkov, and she had entered the country 15 years ago as part of a refugee program. But, according to Sarah's contact, Elena Volkov had died in a car accident in Russia 20 years ago. Someone had stolen her identity and used it to enter the United States. William listened to this information in stunned silence. The woman he had been married to for 15 years wasn't just hiding her past. She was living under a dead person's identity. Whoever she really was had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this false life. Sarah warned William that he might be in danger. Based on the evidence, it appeared that Catherine was involved in something much more serious than simple identity theft. The missing persons cases, the multiple identities, the secretive meetings, it all pointed to organized criminal activity. William wanted to contact the police immediately, but Sarah advised caution. They needed more evidence before making any accusations, especially since Catherine had been so careful to cover her tracks. If they moved too quickly, she might disappear, and they would never get answers. Over the next week, William lived in a state of constant fear and paranoia. Every time Catherine smiled at him or touched his hand, he wondered if she was planning something terrible. He started varying his routines, taking different routes to work, and avoiding being alone with her whenever possible. Catherine seemed to sense his change in behavior. She began asking questions about his day in more detail, wanting to know where he went and who he talked to. Her questions felt less like loving concern and more like surveillance. William confided in Sarah about his growing fear. She suggested installing hidden cameras in their house to document Catherine's activities when he wasn't around. The idea made William uncomfortable. It felt like a violation of trust. But he realized that trust was meaningless when it came to someone who had built their entire relationship on lies. The cameras revealed disturbing patterns. When Catherine thought she was alone, her entire personality changed. She spoke on the phone in what William now recognized as Russian, her voice cold and businesslike. She spent hours on her laptop, using encryption software to communicate with unknown contacts. Most alarming of all, she practiced different accents and mannerisms in front of the mirror, as if preparing for various roles. One recording showed Catherine examining William's daily schedule, which she kept in a small notebook hidden in her dresser. She had detailed notes about his habits, his work meetings, his relationships with coworkers, and friends. It was clear she had been studying him as carefully as he was now studying her. Sarah brought in additional investigators to help piece together Catherine's true identity and criminal activities. They discovered a pattern of women using similar methods across multiple cities over the past 2 decades. Each woman would assume a false identity, establish a relationship with a wealthy man, and then either the man would disappear or suffer a fatal accident, leaving their assets to their grieving widow. The investigation revealed that Catherine had been married twice before under different names. Both previous husbands had died in circumstances that appeared accidental but raised questions upon closer examination. One had fallen downstairs in his home, breaking his neck. The other had drowned in a lake during what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway. William felt physically ill when he learned this information. He realized that his life had been in danger for 15 years, and he had been completely unaware. The woman he loved, who had shared his bed and his dreams, was likely a serial killer who had been planning his death from the moment they met. Sarah advised William to maintain his normal routine while they gathered more evidence. They needed to catch Catherine in the act of criminal activity to ensure she couldn't escape justice. But William found it almost impossible to pretend everything was normal when he looked at his wife and saw a stranger who had been planning his murder. The stress began to affect William's health and work performance. He lost weight, developed insomnia, and found it difficult to concentrate on anything other than the investigation. His coworkers noticed the changes and asked if he was feeling well, but William couldn't tell anyone the truth about what he was going through. Catherine seemed to be growing suspicious of his behavior. She began following him more frequently, always with plausible excuses about being in the same area for work. William spotted her watching him from across the street outside his office building, pretending to talk on her phone while keeping her eyes fixed on the entrance. The investigators discovered that Catherine had been slowly transferring money from their joint accounts to offshore banks. Small amounts at first, but the transfers had been increasing in frequency and size over the past 6 months. She was preparing to disappear, which suggested that she might be planning to complete her final act with William soon. William's fear turned to a cold determination to survive and expose Catherine before she could hurt him or anyone else. He began documenting everything: her phone calls, her mysterious absences, her lies about her daily activities. He copied files from her laptop when she was sleeping and forwarded them to Sarah for analysis. The breakthrough came when the investigators identified Catherine's real name through facial recognition software and international criminal databases. She was actually Natasha Kozlov, a Russian national wanted by Interpol for fraud, identity theft, and suspected involvement in the disappearances of at least 8 men across 3 countries. Natasha had been operating her scheme for over 20 years, becoming increasingly sophisticated in her methods. She would spend months or even years establishing credible false identities before selecting her targets. She preferred men who were successful but isolated, divorced, widowed, or simply lonely men who would be grateful for her attention and less likely to ask difficult questions about her past. William fit her preferred victim profile perfectly. He had been divorced when they met, with few close friends or family members who might investigate if something happened to him. His successful consulting business made him financially attractive, and his trusting nature made him an easy target for manipulation. Sarah presented William with evidence that Natasha had been planning his death for at least 6 months. She had researched various methods that would appear accidental, including staged car crashes, poisoning that would mimic natural causes, and arranged robberies gone wrong. The investigators found detailed notes about William's daily routines, his health conditions, and his relationships that would help her plan the perfect crime. The moment of truth was approaching. Sarah and her team were ready to coordinate with law enforcement to arrest Natasha, but they needed to be careful about timing. If she suspected she was being investigated, she might either flee immediately or accelerate her plans to eliminate William. William struggled with the decision of whether to confront Natasha directly or wait for the authorities to arrest her. Part of him wanted to look her in the eye and demand explanations for 15 years of lies. Another part of him was terrified of what she might do if she realized her carefully constructed life was about to collapse. That William's decision came sooner than expected. On a Tuesday morning in November, Catherine announced she was planning a romantic weekend getaway to a cabin by the lake, the same type of location where her previous husband had drowned. William's blood turned cold as he realized this might be her planned finale. He immediately called Sarah, who confirmed his worst fears. The cabin Catherine had booked was isolated, with no nearby neighbors or cell phone coverage. It would be the perfect place to stage an accident. Sarah urged William to refuse the trip, but he made a different choice. He would go, but not as Catherine's unsuspecting victim. Working quickly with the investigation team, they developed a plan. William would wear a wire to record everything Catherine said and did during the weekend. Law enforcement would be stationed nearby, ready to move in at the first sign of danger. It was risky, but it might be their only chance to catch Catherine in the act and prevent her from simply disappearing to find another victim. The days leading up to the weekend were the most stressful of William's life. He had to maintain the pretense of excited anticipation while knowing he was walking into what was likely meant to be his execution. Catherine seemed unusually affectionate during this time, which now struck William as the behavior of a predator preparing to strike. She cooked his favorite meals, bought him small gifts, and spoke constantly about their future together. These gestures, which once would have warmed his heart, now filled him with revulsion. He understood that this was part of her pattern, making her victims feel loved and secure before destroying them. William noticed Catherine making subtle preparations that supported his suspicions. She cleaned the house thoroughly, organizing papers and documents as if preparing for an extended absence. She canceled several upcoming appointments without explanation. Most tellingly, she withdrew a large sum of cash from their joint account, claiming she wanted to pay for weekend activities. The investigation team discovered that Catherine had used a false name to book the cabin, paying in cash and providing fake identification. She had also rented a car under another false identity, separate from the one she used in her daily life with William. These preparations suggested she was planning to assume a completely new identity after the weekend. On Friday afternoon, they drove toward the lake. Catherine chatted cheerfully about the beautiful fall scenery and her excitement about spending uninterrupted time together. William responded as naturally as he could, all while aware of the recording device hidden beneath his shirt and the GPS tracker the investigators had placed in his watch. The cabin was exactly as isolated as William had feared. Surrounded by dense forest, with the nearest neighbor several miles away, it would be impossible for anyone to hear calls for help. The lake was deep and cold, perfect for staging a drowning accident. William began to understand how Catherine's previous husband had met his fate. That first evening, Catherine prepared an elaborate dinner with candles and wine. She seemed relaxed and happy, telling stories about imaginary childhood memories and expressing her love for William in ways that would have been touching if he didn't know they were complete lies. She encouraged him to drink more wine than usual, which made him suspicious about her intentions. William pretended to drink heavily while actually consuming very little. He noticed Catherine watching him carefully, as if monitoring his level of intoxication. When he excused himself to use the bathroom, he discovered she had been adding something to his wine glass. The liquid had a slightly bitter taste that hadn't been there before. His heart pounded as he realized Catherine was drugging him, probably with something that would make drowning appear accidental. He quickly activated the emergency signal on his watch to alert the surveillance team, then returned to the dining room acting as if nothing had happened. Catherine suggested they take a romantic walk by the lake to see the moonlight on the water. William agreed, knowing this was likely when she planned to complete her scheme. As they walked toward the water, he could feel the effects of whatever she had given him starting to take hold, a slight dizziness, and loss of coordination that would make it difficult to swim or fight back. The investigators had prepared for this possibility, giving William a mild stimulant to counteract common sedatives. As Catherine led him to a secluded section of the lake shore, William fought to stay alert and ready for whatever she might do. Catherine's behavior began to change as they reached the water's edge. Her affectionate demeanor faded, replaced by a cold calculation that chilled William more than the night air. She began asking strange questions about his will, his business insurance, and whether anyone knew exactly where they had gone for the weekend. William realized that Catherine was preparing to kill him, but she wanted to ensure she would benefit financially from his death and avoid suspicion. She had probably asked similar questions to her previous victims in their final moments, gathering information she needed to successfully claim their assets. The moment of truth came when Catherine suggested they wade into the water for a moonlight swim. William refused, claiming the water was too cold. Catherine became insistent, her voice taking on a harder edge that he had never heard before. When he continued to refuse, she grabbed his arm and tried to pull him toward the lake. William pulled away and confronted her directly. He told her he knew about her real identity, her previous marriages, and her criminal history. Catherine's mask finally slipped completely. The loving wife disappeared, replaced by the cold-blooded killer she had always been. Catherine laughed and asked how long William had known. She seemed almost relieved that she no longer had to maintain her act. She told him that playing the loving wife had become tedious, and she was looking forward to moving on to her next identity and next victim. What followed was a chilling confession as Catherine described her methods in detail. She explained how she selected her victims, how she created false identities, and how she had planned each death to appear accidental. She spoke about her previous husbands with casual indifference, describing their deaths as necessary business transactions. Catherine revealed that she had been planning William's death almost from the beginning of their relationship. She had married him because he fit her victim profile perfectly, and she had spent 15 years carefully positioning herself to inherit his assets. The romantic marriage William had cherished was nothing more than a long-term con game. She described how she had been gradually poisoning William with small doses of heavy metals for months, causing his recent health problems, and ensuring that his death would appear to be from natural causes if the drowning plan failed. She had researched his family medical history and chosen toxins that would mimic conditions that ran in his family. William was horrified to learn that his recent fatigue, memory problems, and digestive issues were not due to stress from the investigation, but from systematic poisoning by the woman who slept beside him every night. Catherine had been slowly killing him while he remained completely unaware. The recording device captured every word of Catherine's confession as she described her crimes with pride rather than remorse. She had killed not just for money, but because she enjoyed the power and control. She viewed her victims as weak fools who deserved their fate for being so easily manipulated. Catherine explained that she had been trained in her methods by a criminal organization that specialized in long-term cons and identity theft. She was part of a network of women who used similar techniques across different countries, sharing information and resources to avoid detection by law enforcement. When William asked why she had chosen to reveal the truth instead of simply completing her plan, Catherine explained that she had been ordered to relocate immediately due to increased law enforcement attention on the organization. She had decided to eliminate William quickly rather than risk being caught, and his confrontation had simply moved up her timeline. Catherine pulled a knife from her jacket and told William he would die that night, but it would no longer look like an accident. She planned to make it appear as if they had been attacked by a random intruder, allowing her to play the role of traumatized surviving widow before disappearing with his assets. The confrontation turned physical as Catherine lunged at William with the knife. Despite the effects of the drugs in his system, William managed to defend himself, grabbing Catherine's wrist and struggling for control of the weapon. The years of pretending to be a loving wife had not diminished her strength or fighting skills. During their struggle, Catherine continued talking, revealing more details about her criminal network and her methods. She described other crimes she had committed beyond the murders, including art theft, insurance fraud, and blackmail schemes. She had been living a double life not just with William, but participating in criminal activities throughout their marriage. The investigation team, monitoring from nearby, heard the sounds of struggle and moved in immediately. They arrived to find William and Catherine fighting desperately beside the lake, both of them injured but William gradually gaining the upper hand despite the sedatives in his system. Catherine's arrest was dramatic and violent. She fought against the officers, screaming threats in Russian and English. Even in handcuffs, she maintained her defiant attitude, showing no remorse for her crimes or concern for the pain she had caused her victims and their families. As law enforcement secured the scene, William collapsed from exhaustion, trauma, and the effects of months of poisoning. He was rushed to the hospital where doctors began treating him for heavy metal toxicity and monitoring him for other health effects of Catherine's systematic poisoning. The investigation team recovered extensive evidence from the cabin and Catherine's belongings. She had brought detailed plans for staging William's death, including equipment for weighing down his body in the lake and chemicals to accelerate decomposition. Her preparation was thorough and professional, confirming that she was part of a sophisticated criminal operation. Catherine's arrest triggered a broader investigation into the criminal network she had described. Law enforcement agencies in multiple countries began coordinating to identify other members of the organization and their victims. Catherine's detailed records, which she had kept as insurance against her criminal partners, provided evidence of crimes spanning 2 decades. The media attention surrounding Catherine's arrest was intense. The story of a serial killer who had operated undetected for 20 years, using false identities to marry and murder wealthy men, captured public imagination and horror. William found himself thrust into unwanted spotlight as the victim who had survived and exposed her crimes. Recovery for William was complicated by both physical and psychological trauma. The heavy metal poisoning had caused serious damage to his nervous system and organs that would require months of treatment. The psychological impact of learning that his entire married life had been an elaborate deception designed to end in his murder was even more devastating. William struggled with feelings of betrayal, violation, and self-doubt. He questioned his ability to judge people and trust his instincts. Every memory of his marriage was now contaminated by the knowledge of Catherine's true intentions. Moments he had treasured as expressions of love were revealed as calculated manipulations by a killer studying her prey. The months following Catherine's arrest became a nightmare of legal proceedings, medical treatments, and psychological recovery for William. Each day brought new revelations about the depth of her deception and the extent of the criminal network she had been part of. The investigation expanded internationally as law enforcement agencies uncovered similar cases across 3 continents. William's first priority was his health. The heavy metal poisoning Catherine had inflicted on him over months required intensive medical treatment. Doctors discovered dangerous levels of mercury, lead, and arsenic in his blood, explaining his recent fatigue, memory problems, and digestive issues. The toxins had been administered so gradually that his body had partially adapted, which probably saved his life. The treatment process was grueling. William underwent chelation therapy to remove the metals from his system, but the damage to his nervous system and organs would take much longer to heal. He experienced tremors, difficulty concentrating, and periods of severe depression that made it hard to function in daily life. Dr. Martinez, the specialist treating William's poisoning, explained that Catherine had chosen her toxins carefully. The metals she used would cause symptoms that could easily be attributed to stress, aging, or common health conditions. If William had died, an autopsy might not have detected the poisoning unless investigators specifically looked for it. The psychological impact was even more challenging than the physical effects. William found himself unable to trust his own judgment about people. If he had been so completely fooled by Catherine for 15 years, how could he ever feel confident in his assessment of anyone else? Simple interactions with coworkers, neighbors, or service providers became sources of anxiety and doubt. Sleep became elusive as William replayed moments from his marriage, searching for clues he should have noticed. He remembered times when Catherine had been away for days, claiming to be working on translation projects. Now he understood she had been traveling to meet with her criminal associates or potentially harming other victims. The investigation revealed that Catherine's criminal network was more extensive than anyone had initially realized. She was part of an organization that operated across multiple countries, with members who specialized in different types of long-term cons. Some focused on elderly victims, others targeted wealthy widows, and Catherine's specialty was successful middle-aged men. FBI agent Rebecca Chun, who was leading the investigation, briefed William on what they had discovered. The organization had been operating for over 30 years, with Catherine joining as a young woman in her early 20s. She had been trained in identity theft, social manipulation, and various methods of killing that would appear accidental. The network maintained detailed records of their operations, partly for coordination and partly as insurance against betrayal by other members. Catherine's arrest had given investigators access to these records, revealing the locations of bodies, details of victims' deaths, and the current identities being used by other network members. William learned that he was not Catherine's first target in their city. Before meeting him, she had pursued relationships with two other men who had ultimately been deemed unsuitable for various reasons. One had been too social, with too many friends who might investigate if something happened to him. The other had financial problems that made him less attractive as a target. Catherine had chosen William after carefully researching his background. His divorce, limited social circle, and successful business made him an ideal victim. She had arranged their meeting at the university library after learning about his habits through weeks of surveillance. Their relationship had been planned and orchestrated from the very beginning. The realization that even their first meeting had been a setup devastated William. Every anniversary, every shared memory, every moment of intimacy had been part of an elaborate deception designed to position her to inherit his assets after his death. The woman he had loved had never existed except as a carefully crafted character designed to manipulate him. Agent Shin revealed that Catherine had been using multiple identities simultaneously throughout their marriage. While living with William as Catherine, she had maintained apartments in 2 other cities under different names. She had been involved in ongoing criminal activities the entire time, including art theft, insurance fraud, and at least 3 other murders. The other victims identified through the network's records were heartbreaking reminders of what Catherine was capable of. A retired teacher in Portland who had died in what appeared to be a home invasion. A small business owner in Denver who had suffered a fatal heart attack that was later determined to be induced by poison. An artist in Seattle who had drowned during what was supposed to be a romantic vacation. Each case followed similar patterns. Catherine would assume a new identity, spend months establishing a relationship with her target, and then arrange their death in a way that would appear accidental or natural. She would inherit their assets, then disappear to start the process again with a new victim in a different location. The financial investigation revealed the scope of Catherine's crimes over 2 decades. She had stolen over $12 million from her various victims, moving the money through complex international transfers to avoid detection. Much of it had been invested in real estate and businesses under false identities, creating a network of assets that would be difficult to trace. William's own finances had been compromised more than he realized. Catherine had been gradually moving money from their joint accounts to offshore banks she controlled. She had also taken out insurance policies on his life, forged his signature on legal documents, and positioned herself to inherit his business and personal assets. The legal proceedings were complicated by Catherine's use of multiple identities and the international scope of her crimes. She fought extradition to countries where she faced murder charges, and her lawyers argued that much of the evidence against her had been obtained illegally through surveillance operations that violated her privacy rights. During pre-trial hearings, William had to face Catherine in court several times. She showed no remorse or acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Instead, she seemed to view the proceedings as an interesting intellectual challenge, often smiling during testimony about her crimes, as if she were proud of her accomplishments. Catherine's attitude during the legal proceedings revealed more about her psychology than her confession at the lake had. She clearly viewed herself as superior to her victims and to law enforcement. She believed her intelligence and skill entitled her to take whatever she wanted from people she considered weak or foolish. The prosecution's case was strengthened by Catherine's own meticulous record-keeping. Her notes about William's daily routines, his health conditions, and his relationships provided clear evidence of premeditation. Her research into various murder methods and her acquisition of poisons demonstrated the calculated nature of her crimes. William's testimony was emotionally devastating for him, but crucial for the prosecution. He had to describe in detail how Catherine had manipulated him, the signs he had missed, and the gradual poisoning that had been slowly killing him. Reliving these experiences in court was traumatic, but William felt he owed it to Catherine's other victims to see that she faced justice. The defense tried to portray Catherine as a victim of the criminal organization, claiming she had been coerced into participating in the murders. They argued that she had been trafficked as a young woman and forced into a life of crime against her will. However, the evidence showed that Catherine had been an enthusiastic and skilled participant who had risen to a leadership position within the network. During the trial, more victims of Catherine's network were identified. Families who had lost loved ones in apparent accidents or mysterious circumstances came forward after seeing news coverage of the case. The investigation expanded to include dozens of suspicious deaths across multiple countries and decades. William found some comfort in connecting with other survivors and victims' families. Support groups helped him process his trauma and understand that he was not responsible for being deceived by such a skilled manipulator. However, the knowledge that Catherine's crimes had affected so many people also added to his sense of guilt about not recognizing her true nature sooner. The international investigation revealed that Catherine's organization was connected to other criminal enterprises, including human trafficking, money laundering, and arms dealing. Her marriage murder scheme was just one part of a larger criminal empire that had operated undetected for decades. As the trial progressed, William learned more disturbing details about Catherine's methods. She had used his home as a storage location for stolen art and documents from other crimes. Their basement contained hidden compartments where she had kept false identification documents, weapons, and evidence of her various criminal activities. Catherine had also been using William's business connections for her criminal activities. She had met potential victims through his professional network, researching his clients and colleagues to identify suitable targets. Some of his business associates had unknowingly provided her with information that helped her plan other crimes. The revelation that Catherine had endangered William's professional relationships and potentially put his colleagues at risk added another layer of violation to his experience. People he cared about had been unwitting participants in her criminal schemes simply by being part of his life. Medical experts testified about the sophisticated nature of Catherine's poisoning methods. She had clearly studied toxicology and had access to substances that were not readily available to the general public. Her knowledge of how to administer poisons gradually to avoid detection demonstrated professional-level expertise in murder techniques. The prosecution also revealed that Catherine had been planning to eliminate William much sooner, but had delayed because she believed she could extract more money from him by extending their relationship. She had been monitoring his business income and waiting for him to close several profitable deals before arranging his death. This information was particularly painful for William because it meant that Catherine's expressions of love and support during his business successes had actually been calculations about when would be the optimal time to kill him. Even her encouragement of his professional achievements had been part of her plan to maximize her financial gain from his murder. The trial also exposed how Catherine had maintained her various false identities. She had paid corrupt officials for genuine government documents and false names, created fictional employment histories through shell companies, and even arranged for fake medical records to support her assumed identities when necessary. Her level of preparation and The resources required for her operations suggested that the criminal network she belonged to was extremely well-funded and sophisticated. They had been able to operate across international borders for decades without being detected by law enforcement, indicating high-level corruption or infiltration of legitimate institutions. As the prosecution presented its case, William began to understand that he had not just been the victim of an individual criminal, but of an organized crime syndicate that treated murder as a routine business operation. Catherine was not a lone wolf killer, but part of a system that had refined techniques for identifying, manipulating, and eliminating victims while avoiding detection. The scope and sophistication of the operation made William feel both more and less violated. On one hand, he had been targeted by professional criminals using methods perfected over decades, which explained why he had been so completely deceived. On the other hand, knowing that he was just one of many victims in a systematic criminal enterprise made his suffering feel less personal and more like collateral damage in a war he hadn't known was being fought. The trial reached its climax when Catherine finally took the stand in her own defense. Her testimony would prove to be the most disturbing part of the entire proceedings, as she revealed the full extent of her criminal career and the psychological mindset that had driven her to commit decades of murder and fraud. Catherine appeared calm and composed as she was sworn in, showing none of the emotion that would be expected from someone facing multiple life sentences. Her lawyer had coached her to appear remorseful and to present herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but Catherine's true personality emerged as soon as she began speaking. Instead of expressing regret for her crimes, Catherine used her testimony as an opportunity to demonstrate her intelligence and superiority over both her victims and the legal system. She spoke about her methods with clinical precision, describing how she had studied her target's psychology to manipulate them more effectively. Catherine explained that she had been recruited into the criminal organization at age 19, but not through coercion as her lawyer had claimed. She had sought them out after reading about their activities in underground criminal networks. She had been attracted to the intellectual challenge of long-term cons and the substantial financial rewards they offered. Her training had been extensive and professional. She had spent 2 years learning languages, studying psychology, practicing different accents and mannerisms, and mastering the art of creating false identities. She had been taught how to research potential victims, how to establish credible backgrounds for her assumed personas, and how to kill without leaving evidence. Catherine described her first victim with the same detachment she might use to discuss a business transaction. He had been a lonely widower in his 60s who had been easy to manipulate through his grief and desire for companionship. She had inherited over $2 million from his estate after arranging his death to appear like a heart attack. The success of her first operation had convinced Catherine that she had found her true calling. She enjoyed the power that came from controlling another person's entire reality. She liked being able to make her victims believe whatever she wanted them to believe, to feel whatever emotions she chose to inspire in them. Over the following years, Catherine had perfected her techniques and become one of the most successful operatives in the criminal network. She had developed specializations in different types of victims and different methods of elimination. Her reputation within the organization had grown to the point where she was consulted on particularly challenging cases. Catherine's testimony revealed that the criminal network operated with the efficiency and structure of a legitimate corporation. They had research departments that identified potential targets, training programs for new recruits, and support services that provided false documents, financial services, and cleanup operations when things went wrong. The organization had been responsible for hundreds of deaths across multiple countries over 3 decades. They operated in cells that maintained minimal contact with each other to prevent the entire network from being exposed if one member was captured. Catherine had been part of a North American cell that had been responsible for over 50 deaths since she joined. William listened to this testimony in horror, realizing that his near-death experience was just a small part of a massive criminal enterprise that had been destroying lives for decades. The woman he had loved and trusted had been one of the most prolific killers in an organization that treated murder as routine business. Catherine's description of her relationship with William was particularly devastating. She explained that she had studied him for months before their first meeting, learning about his habits, his personality, his financial situation, and his emotional vulnerabilities from his divorce. Their encounter at the library had been carefully orchestrated after she had determined the optimal approach for gaining his trust. She described how she had crafted her persona to appeal specifically to William's preferences and needs. Her interests, her personality traits, even her physical appearance had been modified to make her irresistible to him. She had researched his previous relationships to understand what type of woman he was attracted to, then became that woman. Catherine explained that maintaining her false persona with William had required constant effort and attention to detail. She had to remember countless lies about her background, monitor her speech patterns to maintain her assumed accent, and suppress her true personality to play the role of the loving wife he expected. The poisoning had been part of her long-term strategy from early in their relationship. She had been administering small doses of toxins for over 2 years, not to kill him immediately but to weaken his health and create a medical history that would support a natural death when she was ready to complete her plan. Catherine had delayed William's death several times because she had been waiting for optimal conditions. She wanted to ensure that she would inherit maximum assets, that there would be minimal investigation into his death, and that she would be able to disappear safely to assume her next identity. The prosecution pressed Catherine about her other victims, and she provided chilling details about each murder. She described how she had chosen different methods based on each victim's circumstances and vulnerabilities. Some had been poisoned, others had suffered staged accidents, and a few had been killed in ways that appeared to be random crimes. Catherine showed particular pride when discussing the more challenging cases where she had to overcome significant obstacles. She had killed a retired police detective who had been naturally suspicious, a wealthy woman who had employed bodyguards, and a prominent businessman who had extensive security arrangements. Her testimony revealed the international scope of the criminal network's operations. Catherine had committed crimes in the United States, Canada, and several European countries. The organization had members operating on every continent, with each cell adapting their methods to local conditions and legal systems. The network's financial operations were sophisticated enough to rival legitimate multinational corporations. They had their own banks in countries with strict secrecy laws, investment portfolios managed by corrupt financial advisors, and real estate holdings that provided both income and places to hide assets from law enforcement. Catherine explained that the organization had been founded by former intelligence operatives who had used their training and connections to create a criminal enterprise. Many of the techniques they used had been developed originally for espionage and political assassination, then adapted for profit-driven murders. The group had infiltrated legitimate institutions to provide cover for their operations. They had members working in banks, government agencies, law enforcement, and legal firms who could provide information, false documents, or assistance in avoiding prosecution when necessary. Catherine's role in the organization had evolved over the years from simple operative to trainer and strategist. She had been responsible for recruiting and training new members, developing new techniques for identifying and eliminating targets, and planning complex operations that required coordination between multiple operatives. The prosecution introduced evidence that Catherine had been involved in training programs where new recruits learned how to seduce and murder wealthy victims. She had developed curricula that covered psychology, acting techniques, toxicology, and methods for staging accidental deaths. Catherine's students had gone on to commit their own series of murders using her techniques. The investigation had identified at least 12 other killers who had been trained by Catherine and were now operating around the world using her methods. Her influence on the criminal network extended far beyond her own direct victims. The financial investigation revealed that Catherine had personally profited over $15 million from her crimes over 2 decades. She had used sophisticated money laundering techniques to hide her assets, including investments in legitimate businesses, real estate purchases under false names, and accounts in offshore banks. Catherine had also been involved in other criminal activities beyond the marriage murder scheme. She had participated in art theft operations, insurance fraud schemes, and blackmail plots against prominent individuals. Her skills in deception and manipulation made her valuable for many different types of crimes. The prosecution presented evidence that Catherine had been planning to retire from active killing and transition to a leadership role within the organization. She viewed William as her final victim, planning to use the proceeds from his death to purchase a leadership position that would have made her responsible for coordinating operations across multiple countries. Catherine's testimony also revealed the extent of the organization's corruption and infiltration of legitimate institutions. They had paid off police officers, judges, bank officials, and government administrators in multiple countries. Some of these corrupt officials had been knowingly complicit, while others had been manipulated or blackmailed into cooperation. The network had its own intelligence operations that monitored law enforcement activities and identified potential threats to their operations. They had advanced warning systems that allowed operatives to disappear or change identities when investigations got too close to exposing them. Catherine described how the organization dealt with members who became liabilities or who attempted to leave. Several former operatives had been eliminated when they posed security risks, and their deaths had been staged to appear as suicides, accidents, or murders by unrelated criminals. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that Catherine displayed classic symptoms of psychopathy, including a complete lack of empathy, an inability to form genuine emotional connections, and a view of other people as objects to be manipulated for her benefit. The evaluating psychiatrist concluded that she was unlikely to ever feel genuine remorse for her crimes. Catherine's cross-examination by the prosecution was devastating as they forced her to confront the human cost of her crimes. They presented testimony from family members of her victims, describing the impact of their losses on children, parents, and communities. Catherine showed no emotional response to these accounts of suffering she had caused. When confronted with evidence of the pain she had inflicted on William specifically, Catherine actually smiled and explained that his suffering was irrelevant to her. She viewed him as weak and foolish for being so easily manipulated, and she felt he had deserved whatever happened to him for being naive enough to trust her. The prosecution's final questions focused on whether Catherine felt any regret about her crimes or concern for the families of her victims. Her answer was chilling in its honesty. She felt no regret about anything she had done, and she viewed her victims' families as collateral damage in necessary business operations. Catherine concluded her testimony by expressing confidence that the criminal organization would continue operating despite her capture. She explained that they had contingency plans for situations like this, and that new operatives were already being trained to replace her and continue her work. The defense's closing arguments attempted to portray Catherine as a victim of circumstances who had been coerced into criminal activity, but her own testimony had demolished any possibility of claiming that she was anything other than a willing and enthusiastic participant in decades of murder and fraud. The prosecution's closing arguments focused on the premeditated nature of Catherine's crimes, the suffering of her victims and their families, and the need to ensure that she could never harm another person. They argued that Catherine represented such a danger to society that she should never be released from prison. As the trial concluded, William reflected on how much his understanding of evil had changed over the past year. He had learned that monsters could appear in any form, that the most dangerous predators were often the most charming and convincing, and that some people were capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions for decades while feeling no guilt about the harm they caused. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. William waited anxiously, knowing that Catherine's conviction would not undo the damage she had done to his life, but hoping it would prevent her from harming anyone else and provide some measure of justice for all her victims. The jury returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Catherine was convicted of multiple murders, conspiracy, fraud, identity theft, and numerous other charges. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences that ensured she would never be free again. Catherine's reaction to the verdict was as disturbing as everything else about her. She showed no emotion when the guilty verdicts were read, and she actually seemed amused when the judge described her crimes as among the most heinous he had ever encountered. As she was led away in shackles, she turned to look at William one last time, and her smile was cold and predatory even in defeat. The conviction marked the beginning of a new phase of investigation as law enforcement agencies around the world used Catherine's information and records to pursue other members of the criminal network. Her detailed files led to arrests in 12 countries and the closure of dozens of cold cases involving suspicious deaths that were now understood to be murders. William found himself at the center of a media storm as news organizations covered the story of the housewife serial killer and the husband who had survived her plot. Reporters wanted interviews, television producers offered money for his story, and publishers approached him about writing a book. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had always valued his privacy. The financial aftermath of Catherine's crimes was complex and painful. Much of the money she had stolen from William and invested in her criminal operations was difficult to recover. Assets hidden in offshore accounts and purchased under false identities were tied up in legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. William's business suffered as clients became uncomfortable working with someone who had been so publicly associated with criminal activity. Some questioned his judgment in being married to a killer for 15 years without realizing her true nature. Others worried about the security implications of working with someone whose personal life had been so thoroughly compromised. The health effects of Catherine's poisoning continued to impact William months after her arrest. The heavy metal toxicity had damaged his nervous system in ways that might never fully heal. He experienced chronic fatigue, memory problems, and periods of confusion that made it difficult to work at his previous level. Dr. Martinez, who continued treating William's poisoning, explained that the long-term effects would likely improve gradually, but some damage might be permanent. The metals Catherine had used were chosen specifically because they caused cumulative harm that would worsen over time if the poisoning had continued. William's relationship with his few close friends and family members became strained as he struggled to process his trauma. He found it difficult to be around people who had known Catherine because every interaction reminded him of how completely she had fooled everyone who met her. Even people who claimed they had always sensed something was wrong with her made William feel worse about his failure to detect her true nature. The psychological counseling William received helped him understand that he was not responsible for being deceived by such a skilled manipulator. Catherine had been trained by professionals to exploit human psychology and emotional vulnerabilities. Her victims included people from all walks of life, many of whom were intelligent and successful individuals like himself. Support groups for victims of long-term deception provided William with connections to others who had experienced similar betrayals. Learning about other cases where people had been manipulated for years by skilled con artists helped him understand that his experience was not unique and that he had no reason to feel ashamed. The investigation into Catherine's criminal network continued to expand as more victims were identified and more operatives were arrested. The scope of the organization's activities shocked even experienced law enforcement officials who had thought they understood the limits of organized crime. Agent Chen briefed William regularly on the progress of the international investigation. The arrests triggered by Catherine's capture had disrupted criminal operations on 3 continents and prevented an estimated dozens of planned murders. The intelligence gathered from the network's records would provide law enforcement with information useful for years to come. William learned that he had been incredibly fortunate to survive Catherine's plot. Most of her victims had never realized they were in danger until it was too late. The combination of circumstances that led to William's discovery of her true identity, the mysterious phone call, the business card, his decision to investigate, had been unlikely coincidences that had saved his life. The criminal network's response to Catherine's arrest and the subsequent investigation was swift and brutal. Several operatives who might have been captured were found dead in apparent suicides before they could be arrested. The organization had contingency plans for protecting itself when members were compromised. Other members of Catherine's cell had disappeared completely, assuming new identities and relocating to countries where they could continue operating. Law enforcement believed that at least 6 other killers trained by Catherine were still active, but their current identities and locations were unknown. The investigation revealed that the criminal network had been responsible for far more deaths than initially estimated. Computer analysis of their records suggested that over 300 people had been murdered by the organization over 3 decades. Catherine's personal kill count of over 20 victims made her one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. William struggled with survivor's guilt as he learned about the extent of Catherine's crimes and the suffering of other victims' families. He wondered why he had been fortunate enough to discover the truth in time, while others had died, without ever knowing they were being targeted by the woman they loved and trusted. The legal proceedings continued for months as prosecutors pursued other members of the network and attempted to recover assets stolen from victims. William was called to testify in several additional cases as investigators used his experience to understand the organization's methods and identify other potential crimes. The media attention gradually faded, but William found that his life had been permanently changed by his experience. His perspective on human nature, on trust, and on the possibility of genuine relationships had been fundamentally altered by learning that the most important relationship in his life had been an elaborate deception designed to end in his murder. William made the difficult decision to sell his house and move to a different city. Too many memories of his life with Catherine were embedded in the home they had shared. Every room reminded him of moments that he now knew had been part of her manipulation, making it impossible for him to find peace there. Starting over in a new location allowed William to begin rebuilding his identity separate from his experience as Catherine's victim. He changed careers, moving from consulting to teaching at a local university where he could help others while avoiding the high-pressure business environment that had made him a target for criminals. The process of recovery was slow and difficult. William had to relearn how to trust his own judgment about people. Simple interactions like dating or forming friendships became complicated by his fear that others might be deceiving him. He found himself analyzing every conversation for signs of manipulation or hidden motives. Therapy helped William understand that his experience with Catherine, while traumatic, had also provided him with valuable insights into human psychology and the nature of deception. His ability to recognize manipulation tactics and false personas, developed through painful experience, could be useful in helping others avoid similar victimization. William began speaking at law enforcement conferences about his experience with Catherine and the warning signs that potential victims should watch for. His first-hand knowledge of how skilled manipulators operated provided valuable training material for investigators working on similar cases. The speaking engagements led to consulting opportunities with organizations that wanted to protect their employees from sophisticated fraud schemes. William found purpose in using his experience to help prevent others from suffering as he had, even though discussing the details of his ordeal remained emotionally difficult. 2 years after Catherine's conviction, William received word that she had died in prison. The official cause was listed as suicide, but William suspected that her former criminal associates had arranged her death to prevent her from providing additional information to law enforcement. Her death brought him a mixture of relief and renewed trauma as it reminded him of the dangerous world she had introduced into his life. Catherine's death triggered additional security measures for William, as law enforcement worried that other network members might target him for revenge or to prevent him from providing further testimony. The protection was temporary, but it served as a reminder that his experience with organized crime had created lasting risks that might never completely disappear. The final resolution of Catherine's estate and the recovery of stolen assets took nearly 3 years. William eventually recovered about 60% of the money she had taken from him, but the legal costs and lost business income meant that he suffered substantial financial losses from her crimes that could never be fully compensated. William found unexpected strength in helping other victims of the criminal network navigate their own recovery processes. His experience and the knowledge he had gained through his ordeal made him a valuable resource for people struggling with similar trauma and betrayal. The relationships William formed with other survivors became an important source of healing and connection. They understood his experience in ways that people who had not been victimized by skilled manipulators could not. These friendships helped him feel less isolated and provided a foundation for rebuilding his capacity for trust. 5 years after Catherine's arrest, William married Sarah, a woman he met through his victim advocacy work. Their relationship developed slowly and carefully, with both of them aware of the challenges created by his past experience. Sarah's patience and understanding helped William learn to trust again without forgetting the lessons his ordeal had taught him. The international investigation into Catherine's criminal network continued for years, gradually dismantling the organization and bringing its members to justice. The information Catherine had provided, combined with intelligence gathered from other arrests, led to convictions in dozens of countries and prevented countless additional murders. William's story became part of training programs for law enforcement, social workers, and financial institutions. His experience illustrated how sophisticated criminal organizations operated and how even intelligent, successful people could be victimized by skilled manipulators using professional techniques. The book William eventually wrote about his experience became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary film that raised awareness about organized crime targeting individuals through romantic deception. The publicity helped identify additional victims and led to the reopening of several cold cases that were eventually solved. William's recovery was never complete. The trauma of learning that his entire married life had been an elaborate murder plot left permanent psychological scars that influenced every aspect of his future relationships. However, he found ways to build a meaningful life despite those limitations, using his experience to help others and to advocate for better protection against sophisticated criminal organizations. The legacy of Catherine's crimes extended far beyond her individual victims. The investigation she triggered led to changes in international cooperation on organized crime, improvements in identity verification systems, and new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths. Her case became a landmark in understanding how criminal organizations exploit human psychology and emotional vulnerabilities. William often reflected on how different his life might have been if he had never discovered Catherine's true identity. He would likely have died believing he was loved by the woman who was actually planning his murder. In some ways, the knowledge of her deception was more painful than death would have been, but it had also given him the opportunity to survive, seek justice, and help prevent others from suffering similar fates. The investigation into Catherine's network never truly ended. Law enforcement agencies around the world continued to use the intelligence gathered from her arrest to identify new cases and pursue remaining operatives. The criminal organization she had been part of was damaged but not destroyed, and its influence continued to be felt in ongoing criminal activities. William's survival and his decision to fight back against Catherine had disrupted one of the most successful criminal enterprises in modern history. His courage in confronting the truth about his marriage and his willingness to testify against the woman he had once loved had helped bring justice to hundreds of victims and prevented countless additional murders. In the end, his discovery of Catherine's hidden truth had saved not only his own life, but the lives of many others who would have been future targets of her criminal network.